My Govanen. Welcome to the Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and in this video I want to talk about height, in specific height of hobbits, height of elves, height of particular characters in the Lord of the Rings. And this is a video I've kind of wanted to do for a while, but it also kind of got sparked by a comment on one of my other videos asking about how tall Eowyn is. And there's really no definitive answer to that question, but I think we can get a close approximation. So let's take a look at the sources we do have and go from there and see what we can figure out. So as I mentioned, this was kind of sparked by a comment on one of my previous videos, and the person who commented mentioned that we know that Aragorn is 6'6", and this kind of took me by surprise because I don't remember Tolkien ever being quite that specific. And he said he saw it somewhere but didn't remember where, so I started looking around on the internet, and sure enough, there actually is a source for this. And it's unpublished, which is why I'd never seen it before. But it is recorded in the Hammond and Skull Reader's Companion to the Lord of the Rings, and so in that sense it's published, but not published by Christopher Tolkien or anything like that. Hammond and Skull had access to, manuscripts and things in the Bodleian Library, so they had access to stuff that even Christopher Tolkien hasn't published yet for their Reader's Companion. So that's part of the basis for this video. But before we get to that, let's look at just the canonical, what you might call the canonical published stuff. Generally speaking, we only ever get references to so-and-so was tall. And generally speaking, every important character is tall, so that doesn't help us much. In the prologue to the Lord of the Rings of concerning hobbits, it does tell us that hobbits range between 2 and 4 feet, seldom more than 3, but they used to be taller. And that's pretty much all we get on the height of hobbits, and that doesn't help us much at all. Then we get a reference to, let's see, in Fellowship of the Ring, we do get told that Celeborn and Galadriel are very tall, and that Galadriel herself is no less tall than Celeborn. It tells us that. And this is going to be important later because there's more information coming up about them. Beyond that, in the main published information, we don't get much of any real information other than, like I said, so-and-so is tall. And occasionally you'll get references to somebody is a little bit taller than other people or whatever. So, I mean, I think we do get a reference in the Fellowship that Boromir is broader than Aragorn, but Aragorn is taller. And there may even be a comparison between Aragorn and Legolas at some point, but I don't remember specifically, and I didn't have forever to look that up. At any rate, the information we have outside of this comes mainly from two sources. We have the Unfinished Tales, and in particular there's the story of the disaster of the Gladden Fields, which I've done a video on before, and I'll link to that. There's an extra set of manuscripts associated with it that talk about linear measurements of the Númenóreans, and then there's the Hammond and Skull reference to this unpublished note that Tolkien wrote. So let's start with the Unfinished Tales, because that's the earlier piece in terms of when it became available pretty much, and look at what that tells us about height, and then we'll finish off with that hitherto unpublished note about the Hammond and Skull reference. So in the Unfinished Tales, we have this piece of paper that Christopher Tolkien finds that starts discussing linear measurements by the Númenóreans, and he goes into not just height, but also like walking distances and things like that, things that approximate a league in modern English, which is about 3 miles. But what we're concerned with is the height thing, and so what Tolkien says is that this is kind of based off of what the Númenóreans would have considered basically an average stride, which is called a ranga, and he says it's approximately 38 inches, slightly longer than our yard. And he, keeping up the pretense of this is all historical and there are sources for this, he basically says it's impossible to really know for sure because you have to approximate based on what people said about different things because they weren't using feet and we can't know exactly, So even in his notes to himself, more or less, he's still in the mode of this is a work I've translated. So that's interesting. But the ranga is 38 inches, roughly, he says. And he says that 2 ranga was considered man-high, And he says that this isn't necessarily a precise measurement of how tall the average man was. It's more an approximation of, this is the unit of measure they had to work with, and about 2 of them is roughly how tall a man is. So that doesn't mean necessarily that Numenorians averaged 76 inches tall. Which would have been, 6'4". But it means that that's probably at least fairly close. Now, he goes from here, and then he says that Elendil, who was taller than average, and indeed the tallest of, all the Numenorians to escape from the downfall of Numenor, and who was indeed called the Tall, was taller by a half a runga than the average man. Now, that would put him at 19 inches taller if we go by 38 inches, which would put him, the text says, nearly half a runga, so that puts us probably somewhat less than 19 inches, but if you added 19 inches to 6'4", that would give us 7 feet 11 inches tall. So even if you go nearly, we're still probably looking at something like 7.5 feet tall, which is really, really tall. So that gives us an idea of how tall Elendil is, although there's an asterisk we need to put by that, and I'll come back to that later. But he goes on and talks about Celeborn and Galadriel as well. He mentions that Galadriel is also man-high, and says, well, he doesn't say in the same thing, but if we take that to be true, then that would mean Galadriel is 6'4". And he also mentions that the Eldar generally, Eldar being elves, of course, are very tall. And he also says that, like I mentioned before in The Lord of the Rings, it says that she's no less tall than Celeborn, which is interesting because that would actually make Celeborn relatively short for a male, but then there's a secondary piece of paper associated with this in the Unfinished Tales where it says that the Teleri, the branch of the elves from which Celeborn is from, are actually shorter than the Noldor, which is Galadriel's parentage, although Galadriel has Noldor, Vanyar, and Telerin ancestry. She's got a little bit of all three. But apparently the Noldor were taller than the Teleri, at least. He doesn't really get into the Vanyar. And so it actually, he mentions too, that Galadriel is the tallest female elf we get reference to in any of these stories. And even in some of the other stuff about Celeborn and Galadriel, which is published in the Unfinished Tales, it talks about how she's abnormally tall and also abnormally athletic for a woman and all this other stuff. So we get the idea that Galadriel is 6'4", roughly, and so is Celeborn because he's a Telerin elf as opposed to a Noldorin elf. Now the appendix, where it talks about Galadriel's height and all that, it also talks about Hobbit height. And here it says, more specifically than in the prologue to The Lord of the Rings, that hobbits ranged between 3 and 4 feet, never less, seldom more. This would seem to contradict of Concerning Hobbits, but you have to remember what the of Concerning Hobbits bit said, which is they're shorter now than they used to be. And in this Unfinished Tales text, it also specifically says they are smaller now than this, and so this is not reflective of their current stature. So we get the idea from this that the hobbits in the Lord of the Rings stories themselves would have been 3 to 4 feet, whereas what the prologue is talking about is hobbits now, whenever now is relative to the prologue. So hobbits then, if they start at 3 feet and then they range up to 4 feet, seldom higher than that, we get the idea that maybe by the end of the adventure, Merry and Pippin may be on that 4 foot or maybe even slightly taller range because they seem to have grown from drinking the Ent drafts of Fangorn. But at any rate, it refers also to the fact that hobbits are called halflings by the Dunedain, and it says that they were called this at a time when that was basically true. And so that implies that the average height of the hobbit would have been more or less exactly half the average height of a Numenorian. So if we figure that 3 feet is a minimum and 4 feet is a rough maximum for a hobbit's height, that puts us at 6 feet and up for sure for Numenorians. So that would seem to confirm the 6'4" height for an average Númenorian. Another thing I should mention about that Númenorian height, by the way, is that Tolkien says that this reference to Turanga being man high is also from a period somewhat later when Númenorians had begun to diminish in height and therefore were not as tall as they had been. And he basically ascribes this largely due to the loss of Númenor. Once they no longer lived in Númenor after it fell, they began to decline in height, as in other ways, more closely matching the peoples of Middle-earth. And also to the extent that the Númenorians intermarried with other peoples in Middle-earth, that kind of hastened the decline of their height. And of course, this also matches the decline in their lifespans and other things like that. So, I mean, you can see that he's, kind of using both things to say that Númenorians would have been shorter by the time that, we get some of these references. He doesn't say when these references are, but we do know that the hobbits first appeared in records of Dunedain and elf-related, maybe not even elf-related, but at least in the Kingdom of Arnor, hobbits first appeared on anybody's radar in roughly the 11th century in the Third Age. So by that point, you've got over 1,000 years of the Númenorians declining in Middle-earth. So presumably Númenorians in Númenor would have been even taller, which would help explain why Elendil would have been, really, really, really tall. And given that, we might even say that Elendil might have exceeded 8 feet, because at that point the Rongo would have been, Turanga would have been maybe less than man high compared to the later reference that Tolkien says. Who knows? At any rate, we get this reference to hobbits being halflings in an almost literal sense. They're about half the height of a Dunedain. So, if we look at the 6'4", that would put a hobbit at 3'2", which seems maybe a little on the short end since they range 3 to 4 feet and maybe a little higher than 4 feet. But at any rate, it's at least a close approximation. Now, we also get a reference briefly in this text to the fact that the Rohirrim would have been generally shorter than the Númenorians or the Dunedain, and it references the fact that, the people in Middle-earth were, well, let's put it this way, the Rohirrim were related ultimately in some ways to the same groups of men that went to Númenor, but they had been in Middle-earth and intermarrying with other peoples during this time. But it does say that there are certain exceptions to that rule, such as Éomer, Theoden, and Eowyn, because they had ancestry in the people of Gondor as well, because the Gondorians, Theoden's father was married to a Morwen of Lasarnak, who was actually a relative of Prince Imrahil. And you may remember Prince Imrahil, if you've read the book, is at least legendarily supposed to be descended from some possible elf strains as well, who were coming from Lothlorien in earlier dark times. So those people were probably abnormally tall even for Gondorians at the time, and so Éomer and his, near relatives would also have been abnormally tall for Rohirrim. What's interesting here is that the Rohirrim are generally described as being pretty tall in the books, and so we can't really suppose, I don't think, that they're significantly shorter than the average Gondorian, because then it would seem like they would end up being just average compared to everybody else. And then why would they be referred to as tall in multiple cases? So I would tend to think that the average male of Rohan would probably be close to 6 feet, based on just the references we do get. And that would kind of make sense based on, if we look at the Rohirrim as being kind of analogous to Norse or Anglo-Saxon or, just generally Northern European stock, which is kind of what they represent in the story in a lot of ways. The Northern Europeans tend to be among the taller varieties of humans that we get in the Caucasian realm anyway, and that's pretty much what we're dealing with in the Lord of the Rings. So, but then we can look at the Hammond and Skull stuff and we get a little bit more detail on this. So in the Reader's Companion by Hammond and Skull, we get a reference in the Council of Elrond where Elrond is talking about Númenor and stuff, and Hammond and Skull just throw in this reference to this, this piece of paper that Tolkien wrote down some stuff on. They also reference the Unfinished Tales materials, and so you can kind of get this all in one place if you just want to pick up the one volume. But they reference this piece that Tolkien wrote where he said that in Númenor it was common to be 7 feet tall, which again kind of confirms what I said earlier about, if Numenorians were taller in Numenor, then 6'4" may have actually been short for an average. And it also says that the men of the noble houses would have been even taller than the average Numenorian. And it even specifically says that Elendil and Isildur were 7 feet tall. Now, whether that means 7 feet and up or something else, this seems to contradict what he says about Elendil being an extra half ranga taller than the average. And so I'm not sure. Again, Tolkien constantly was changing his ideas about things over time, so it's not clear whether this was meant to supplant one of these two was meant to supplant the other, or if he just forgot about one, or you just never know with Tolkien. So, but at any rate, either way we get an impression that Elendil and even Isildur were 7 feet or taller, which is pretty tall, because you have to remember too that by the time they reach Middle Earth, Numenor has already been on a huge decline, so maybe they're even shorter now than at the heyday of Numenor's power. At any rate, he goes on in this little piece to say that specifically Aragorn is probably 6'6", and this is where that reference comes from. And so you can find references to that on the internet in a couple different places. And it says that Boromir, who would have had relatively pure Numenorian blood, would have been somewhat shorter, probably about 6'4", and Eomer, who was, as we mentioned earlier, descended in part from Gondorian stock, would have been probably 6'6", because he is said to be about the same height as Aragorn. So this gives us a pretty good idea of how tall a lot of these people are. Aragorn and Boromir are both pretty darn tall. Eomer is pretty darn tall. We get the idea from some of these other pieces that the Eldar, the elves, are generally very tall, and Telerin elves are shorter than Noldorin elves, so we can imagine Celeborn is on the shorter end compared to, say, Elrond or Gildor and Glorian, who we meet in the Shire, and some of the other elves that we meet in Rivendell. Those are probably even taller, so probably taller than Aragorn in the realm of like 6'8", 6'10", somewhere probably in that range maybe. Can't say exactly, obviously, but at any rate, Legolas would have been of the Telerin origins more so, and so probably more, along the lines of 6'4", somewhere in that range. He may, I'm trying to remember now, have some Noldorin ancestry. I cannot remember the exact lineage of Thranduil at the moment, but I know Thranduil was at least said to have come from Beleriand. Now, whether he was a Grey Elf or whether he was a Noldorin, I can't remember offhand. So Legolas may have been taller, but at any rate, that gives us an idea of something to work with. So, circling back to our original question, how tall is Eowyn? She's kind of the last piece of the puzzle that we need to fill in here. Obviously, we could talk about other characters, but we very rarely get significant references to them. For example, Faramir, we don't get directly compared to Boromir. We don't know how tall he was relative to other people. It doesn't tell us. Same with Denethor. I think it tells us, like many people, he's tall, but that's about all we get. So Eowyn, how tall is Eowyn? Well, it says in the book that she is tall, which makes sense. She's Eomer's sister, and Eomer is taller than average because of his lineage, which tells me she's probably certainly tall for a woman of Rohan, and probably even edging up close to roughly the height of an average male of Rohan, and this would seem to be borne out by the fact that she can successfully disguise herself as a rider and ride along with Theoden's army and not be easily discovered, although you do get the impression she has some help in the book. At any rate, if I had to peg Eowyn, I would probably say that she is probably pretty close to 6 feet tall, because at that point, I mean, if you figure in modern America, the average male is roughly 5'9" to 5'10". The average female, I think, is about 5'4", 5'5". So 5 to 6 inches difference. So if we take 5 or 6 inches off of Eomer, that gives us right at 6 feet, 6'1", something like that. So, and that would tend to make sense too, because if the Rohirrim are kind of generally slightly taller than the average male at roughly 6 feet, and then Eomer is significantly taller than that because of his ancestry, and Eowyn shares that ancestry, that's going to bump her up as well as him. So it certainly seems reasonable to think that she's probably at least near that 6-foot mark. So, to kind of sum up everything that we've learned here, Aragorn is 6'6", Boromir is 6'4", Eomer is 6'6", Celeborn and Galadriel appear to be about 6'4", and we've got a pretty good idea that most hobbits are going to be probably 3'2" to 3'6" on average, and that means Merry and Pippin are probably roughly at that 4-foot mark, maybe even a little higher after the Ent drafts. And of course, they probably come from taller stock anyway, because the the Brandybucks and the Tooks are the more adventurous types, and they're also kind of the leader types in the Shire, and the leader types in Lord of the Rings are always taller, just always are, because that's just kind of a symbolism thing going on there, I guess. But at any rate, we can assume they're probably, by the end of the story, pretty close to 4 feet tall. The other hobbits, we don't really ever get a reference, but they're probably within that average range, 3'2", 3'8", probably in there. And then other elves, tall, 6'4" and up, probably, especially for the Noldor. And then that's pretty much the ones that we can nail down with any degree of precision. So that's pretty much as far as I can go with this video. If there are any other references out there that anybody knows of that I haven't been able to dig up, please let us know in the comments below and we can discuss. So, hope you enjoyed that video. Hope you learned something new about the characters in Middle-earth. Now you know how tall some of them are, and that might change our perspective on some of them a little bit, because some of them are really tall. And Elendil especially, it was really, really tall. So that's pretty interesting. At any rate, if you did enjoy the video, please do give it a thumbs up and share it around. And if you really enjoy content like this, you can follow me on Twitter at JRRTLore, where I occasionally throw out Tolkien trivia questions as well. Or, of course, you can subscribe to the channel here. And if you really enjoy this, you can support the channel here, and you can find 2 of my previous videos here. Until the next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek, signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namaste.